Hello everybody. Welcome to the Introduction to Land Access and Financial Assessment Workshop. Thank you for taking the time to come here tonight. We hope the information you hear will help you in down your path to a farming lifestyle. So traditionally, farms have passed from one generation to the next through birth, marriage, or death, often with the business intact, but this is happening less and less. So this training is meant for beginners with some experience in farming, or those looking to start a second career, returning from military service, or from an urban or suburban background that want to make their life on the land. And if you look around you today, you'll see the diversity that's in this room. So we'd like to acknowledge our sponsors, supporters for this program. The United States Department of Agriculture elevated the concern of the transition of land from one generation to the next. To do so, they wanted to promote success of beginning farmers and the transfer of land from one generation to the next. USDA provided a grant to American Farmland Trust. American Farmland Trust in turn developed the Farmland for the Next Generation program. 25 individuals from across the country took part in the program and committed to hold at least 2 workshops to test the curriculum that was developed. So what we really do need is for you guys to complete the survey that's in your packet afterwards, because we really want to be able to provide them feedback if these workshops met your needs, if there's information that we didn't address that you think would have been helpful. They will then finalize the curriculum, and we're committed to hold a Train the Trainer program so that there'll be more individuals throughout the state that can assist beginning farmers. So I'm Cindy Roberts, and my colleague Chuck Rohr participated in the program for the Farmland for the Next Generation. We work for the State Agriculture Development Committee, or SADC. The SADC leads preservation of New Jersey's farmlands and promotes innovative approaches to maintaining the viability of the agricultural industry. And to do this, we provide grants to counties, municipalities, and townships to purchase development easements from land so that it is permanently preserved in perpetuity for agricultural use and production. We also provide grants to landowners who have preserved their farm through one of our programs for certain soil and water conservation measures and to install deer fencing. And we administer the right to farm, ag mediation, and land link programs. So 45% of you indicated that you heard about the workshop on our LandLink site. If you haven't been there, you really should check it out. There's a lot of really good information. People that have lands that are looking to sell it or rent it or have business opportunities where they want some assistance can list on there. People that are looking for farming opportunities can also list on the website, and hopefully that'll create some matches. In New Jersey, one of the biggest barriers that face beginning farmers is access to land. While some beginning farmers can afford to buy land, most will look to leasing when starting a new farm venture because of high land costs. However, finding secure long-term leases can be difficult as well. So during this presentation, we're going to talk about land tenure in New Jersey, your personal and business goals, how to assess your financial position, and you'll hear from Keith Dickinson from Farm Credit East on how to determine your readiness to access land. So let's start with land tenure and land access. Typically, when we talk about land tenure, and for this training, we're talking about how farmers hold their land, which is usually by owning it or farming it. Some farmers can develop special circumstances where a formal land tenure agreement is not required. Usually that's for a smaller piece of ground that the landowner wants to get farmland assessment for, but they're not farmers. It could be a barter arrangement where you agree to work on the bulk of the farm or let the landowner use your equipment. It could be just because the farmer or landowner knows the farmer well enough that a handshake is enough. That happens a lot in the land deals that we're doing. It's just a verbal agreement when we go to preserve the farm, or just that the landowner wants the farm farmed for any other reason, and but doesn't want to have a formal agreement. And now Chuck is going to come up and talk about securing land tenure.
So welcome everybody. As Cindy mentioned, my name is Chuck Rohr. I work here with Cindy at the Farmland Preservation office, and I was one of the 2 folks selected to be trained in land access through American Farmland Trust grant program and to administer that in New Jersey. You'll soon find out that Cindy is the brains of this operation, but I was selected for 2 reasons. One, they needed somebody to pick up the heavy objects that Cindy didn't want to carry. And 2, my background. So I've worked here at the department for a little more than 15 years. Prior to starting my job here and simultaneously while I've worked here, I have run my own small farm business out of my parents' farm in Burlington County, not far from here. So having a foot in both the government world and the real ag production world, folks higher than me thought would be a good perspective to have when putting on this kind of training. So with that, I have 2 subjects that I'll be covering mostly tonight, and that is this land access, how do you get it, who do you get it from, and then goal setting. So goal setting is more than just, I want to get on a farm and make $1 million this year and $2 million next year. You've also got to consider your personal goals, your family goals, lifestyle, that kind of thing. So without further ado, get into my part. So when you're going to find a piece of property, I mean, it's going to be very important that you look at a number of different things before you sign on the dotted line. Affordability and availability. So you need to have land that's within your price range. And where is that available? You're going to find in different parts of the state that prices for buying and leasing land vary pretty widely. One of the things, and this information, the sources of all this, we have available here at the department. As Secretary Fisher was saying, if you come up with questions, you want to know anything in more detail about any of the things brought up tonight, please call the office and we'll be happy to get you that. Stability. So if you're looking to start a farm operation, you're probably not looking at it as a short-term venture. This is something you want to do longer term. And so stability of the land, is the land something that's going to be there next year for you, or is this property in the middle of a highly developed area and the landowner is looking to sell as soon as they get the right offer? And then also stability with the landlord. So you do really have to figure out, if you're going to lease land, who is your landlord, what are they all about, and are you going to get along with them? There's a lot of stories out there where people found a great piece of property, and after a year or 2, they and the landlord had a difference of opinion or philosophy, and it didn't work out. And in a sense, the landlord's holding a lot of the cards, and the tenant left and had kind of wasted 2 years. The other thing is compatibility with land use laws, leases, and deed terms. So is the town that you're in, do the local ordinances and things allow for the type of farming operation that you want to have? There are cases all over the state where that is not the situation. Some towns are much more farm friendly than others. The state does have a right to farm program, which is a very strong piece of legislation that does give farmers some cover, but it's not absolute. And if you're working in a town that is not farmer friendly, it's just another headache that you probably don't need. So you want to consider that when you're figuring out, where am I going to locate my farm business? Lease, you want to make sure the lease terms that you're agreeing to are what you can live with. The SADC, actually, Dave right there by the coffee pot, actually wrote a leasing guide for the department. I believe we have copies of it. It's inside the packet. You want to take a look at that. It offers suggestions on what's a good lease for the tenant, but what's a good lease for the landowner also. they want to make sure certain things get covered and that their land is in as good or better shape when you leave than when you found it. So that's a very good document for you guys to consider when you get to the point where you want to do a lease. Deed terms, this is just one of our pet ideas because we work here for the Farmland Preservation Office. About 250,000 acres of land in New Jersey that is farmland assessed has our farmland preservation deed of easement on it. So about a third of the land that's out there has a farmland preservation deed of easement, and they are very compatible with almost all types of farming operations. That's what they're meant to do. But if you have a farm that's preserved, you definitely want to find out, what strings come attached with that. Some other considerations are income versus equity. So are you looking at this property to generate income and that's it? In which case you probably could do that on a short-term basis. It would only take you one season to generate some income. And you could probably very easily figure out, my terms of this arrangement are going to cost me X, and I know I can produce this much in a good season, so the profit will be Y. Income, it could be long-term too. But income and equity are different in that equity is a more of a longer-term proposition. So equity could be, a lot of times, landowners may want to trade or barter. You hear the term sweat equity all the time. That happens a lot with family operations, where you're putting in time, skill, or something else of value in addition to or in lieu of actual cash that helps build you some kind of stake in that operation. That's one type of equity. Another type of equity would be the land itself. If you're getting on a piece of property that needs a little work, you may be the one who has to put soil amendments into it. You may have to lime it. There may be infrastructure needs to operate your farm that are more capital intensive. That's an equity stake that if you're not going to be on this land long term, you want to make sure what you're getting into. Housing, infrastructure, and other facilities. So these are things, when you're trying to locate your piece of property, you need to know, what are the things that I have to have today to start this operation? If you have to live on the farm, well then, you need to find a farm that has on-farm housing. If you're going to have livestock and you need a barn or you need fencing to start your operation, that's what you have to consider when you're looking at properties. And then there's some things that probably can wait. Maybe you can work with an okay barn, but in the future you need a much nicer barn to see your business goals through the end. So there's some things you need the day of, and there's some things you need that you could work on, but those day of considerations, that has to be part of your plan when you're assessing what property am I going to get. So land access. All right, so land access obviously involves land seekers. That would probably be most of the people in this room, landowners. Then you've got realtors, you've got professionals, you've got people in the community. A lot of people involved in how are you going to find this land, whether it is a lease or a purchase. Then you've got the different paths to getting on the land. So you can buy it. That sounds simple enough, but that's a pretty expensive proposition. You can lease it, which is probably how most beginning farmers are going to end up on their property. And when you're leasing it, you'll be leasing from either a private landowner, possibly a nonprofit, or a government agency. That could be a township or county or the state. There's a lot of government-owned farmland in New Jersey. You have to understand who am I dealing with? Because a private landowner, perhaps someone who owns land but lives in Florida, their motivation is going to be different than a nonprofit that bought this property because they wanted to see it stay this way for some reason, versus a township who probably just wants to see it kept tidy. So you have to know who you're dealing with in order to make the best attempt at getting the best lease and what's motivating the people who you're dealing with. And that's going to be different depending on who you're dealing with. Inheriting or accepting land. Anybody in here in the market to inherit land anytime soon? Oh, you're ready to get, all right, but it's not lined up yet. I don't have any for you to inherit, but so those are far and few between, but if it happens, that's a great thing, but it is definitely has its own hurdles that you'd have to deal with, and that's a little bit, one of our future presentations is succession planning, and if you're dealing with a landowner who maybe it's not even you're going to inherit it, but they're looking to the next generation, what's going to happen with the property, that'd be a good course to also consider taking. So, research, due diligence, and patience. when you're looking for a piece of land, you definitely want to do your research and understand what am I getting myself into here? Does this property have what I need? Due diligence is, like I was saying, about reviewing lease terms, deed of easements, local ordinance issues, that kind of thing. And patience. It is very unlikely that the perfect piece of property for you is going to fall into your lap the first time you go out looking for a piece of property. If you jump the gun and just accept the first piece of property that comes your way, hopefully that works out, but the odds aren't in your favor in that. We hear a lot of stories here at the department, just in the business that we deal in, and some of those stories will make you think twice. So this is a piece of property up in Warren County. Got the call from the fellow who bought this property. After he bought it, it's 55 acres. He paid $500,000 for it. And he said, I could use a little bit of help. My wife and I are going to build a really, really nice high-end horse operation. And we said, okay. And we took a look at the property. And he didn't give us the map this way. I put these in here. But the first thing we noticed on the map that you can get off the USDA website is that giant thing in the middle is a rock outcrop. And that's where he had told me he wanted to put his stable. I said, oh, all right. All right. I've never been in the world of blasting bedrock to build a stable, but okay. So the next thing we said was, what's with all these lines going across the field? And he said, oh, the original farmer put those in like 50 years ago. They're drainage ditches. So we looked it up further, again, on the USDA website, and the depth to seasonal high water table is 6 inches. And so all of these are basically trenches to get water off the field. And my limited knowledge of the horse world is that horses don't like wet feet. So we have a really wet field and a rock outcrop to work with. And he paid $500,000 for it. And I said, wow, all right, we have our work cut out for us. So that's a story of someone thinking they found a great piece of property, signing on the dotted line, and really didn't do the amount of research they probably should have done. Another interesting story, we have a small organic farm that was able to bump up to a really large, beautiful piece of property near them. They ended up with a great farm and a fantastic landlord who was very supportive of what they wanted to do and their philosophy in their farm. And 3 years into it, they can't get a break from the township on local ordinances and things that they want to do on the farm. And it's essentially putting them to a point where they can't be there anymore. So they've invested 3 years of time and input and put some infrastructure on the property with a great farm and a great landlord, but they just can't make it work due to the township regulations. And so they're looking to pull up stakes and find another property in a different town. So it's just examples of doing the research ahead of time and being patient with it. All right. So I don't think anybody doesn't know this, but one of the biggest barriers in New Jersey to getting on a farm is the super high cost of land. $12,800 per acre is the average. That is only second to Rhode Island, and there is commentary that some people don't consider Rhode Island a real state, so that would make us the highest cost of land in the country. $12,800 per acre for non-preserved ground is the average. I would say, without any science behind it, an hour to New York City or 30 minutes to Philadelphia, and it's going to be more than that. So things to consider. Preserved land, again, the average, $5,000 to $12,000 an acre if you're buying. So no matter how you cut it, those are big nuts to crack and definitely considerations. When you talk about buying land, your competition is going to be existing established farmers, lifestyle buyers, so people who want to live in the country but not necessarily farm, just have a place in the country. Real estate speculators, if it's not developed, or real estate speculators in general. We actually have a number of real estate speculators who purchase preserved land exclusively because they see the value of preserved land going up as a safe bet rather than putting their money in stocks. And then if it's not developed, obviously you've got developers to contend with. So there's some stiff competition, especially considering 3 of those 4 buyers, they don't need to make their living from the farm. And so they're buying with a different mindset than a farmer is and especially a beginning farmer. So renting or leasing land. This says maybe a more cost-effective way to get started, but I would cross that out. I would say it's definitely a more cost-effective way to get started. Long-term, buying land can be the way to go for sure. But if you're just starting this business, if you don't have a ton of free capital to put towards it, renting and leasing land is a much safer bet. So you're going to have, these are average rental payments, $128 an acre for irrigated ground, $50 to $75 for non-irrigated ground, and that's annually. So I don't know how many acres everyone here is thinking about working with, but if it's a small farm, 10 acres or less, these are not big numbers to crack versus what it would cost to pay the mortgage on those. So you've got some cash flow freed up to operate your business. You don't have the monthly mortgage, and you're in business. So this is a good way to get started. And just a little side note, these averages, they're typically if you're renting the whole farm. If you don't need the whole farm, there are farmers who will rent you just as many acres as you want, but you probably should expect to pay a premium above these prices if you're just renting a few acres. Rental rates, they vary on a bunch of things. Location is huge, so proximity to markets. Wherever you're planning to sell your stuff, if you're close to the New York City market, if you're close to the Philly market, you're going to pay for that. Populations, if you're close to high concentrations of people, you're probably going to pay up for that, but that probably allows you some other options, such as have a market on the farm and there's enough people close by to come to you. And then resources. So what are the resources you need to run this farm? You need the same resources everybody else does. So if you're in an area that has the great tractor dealer, that has the local butcher, that has the local supply places, that's where other farmers are going to want to locate. And so you'll probably end up paying up for that. Land quality. So you saw the map of the fellow who bought a farm that didn't have fantastic land quality. The better the land, probably realistically, the more it would go for. And the lesser quality, the less it's going to go for. And that could vary depending on what your operation is, what you need. A pasture farm that only requires grass and pasture needs a lot less high quality soils than someone who's going to do intensive vegetable production. So just the considerations of what you need and what you can work with. Improvements, obviously, if the property has already had some improvements, to, the other folks who've rented it have been keeping up with it, you're in better shape, but you're going to end up paying for that. Water availability is a big one coming from a vegetable background. So personally for me, that's a big one. Whether you've got an irrigation source and a way to get it out into your fields is a big deal. You're going to pay up for that, as you can see, 128 versus 50 to 75. But the first August that it doesn't rain and you've got all your crops in the field, it's like buying insurance. You need it when you need it. And so it's great to have, but you will pay up for it a little bit. Considering the value of your crops, that's probably a worthwhile thing to consider. And existing infrastructure. So the more stuff the farm has on it for you to use, the more efficient your operation is going to be, but the more you're going to pay in rent to get that. All right, so who owns the land? Most of the land is private landowners. Some of them are farmers, some of them are non-farmers. A smaller amount of land, but still not an insignificant portion, is public landowners. So land trusts, nonprofits, quite a few in New Jersey, and very many of them have been very intrigued by the project Cindy and I are doing tonight and have expressed an interest in, hey, if you get some beginning farmers who need some land, we've got some acreage here, there, and other places. We'd like to partner up with you guys on that. So definitely a consideration. As I mentioned earlier, towns, counties, the state, they own land and they often put it out to bid, public bid process usually. And then institutions, so hospitals, universities, corporate campuses, lots of big operations have excess land that's part of their facility. And a lot of them have recently gotten onto that trend of they want to see something happen to it besides the groundskeeper mow it. So if you drive up Route 1 north just before you get to Princeton, there's a very big corporation that has converted their front lawn into, it's now a grain field, but they're having farmers farm their ground. A lot of townships have said, well, if we didn't have to have the public works guys mow this field because we had a farmer farming it, that'd be a win-win. So they're out there. Out of the 720,000 farmland assessed acres in the state, about just a little less than 40% of it is owned by someone who doesn't farm it. So that means there's an opportunity out there for you to get onto land, but you really should understand who is my landowner, who am I dealing with, and what's their motivation so that I can get them motivated to take me on as the farmer. All right. So now we get into the goals part and what affects your readiness. So you've got personal goals and business goals. Business goals, obviously, we want the business to do well. We want to make profit. Personal goals, what is it you're looking to get out of this operation? Is it time? Do you not like the cubicle job? Is it family? You want to have your family raised on a farm. All kinds of considerations. And do those two mesh? So you're starting a new business. Starting any new business is very time intensive. Is that going to mesh okay with your personal goals? Current financial position, you're going into this. There's going to be like any new business. You're going to have to know what your position is, and it's going to take some capital to get started. Resources. So what resources are available to you? Or you've heard tonight, there's a lot of government resources that we can provide through the state, through the USDA and other agencies. We're happy to sort that out for you. But you also want to consider, what do I have close by? Like what could I have access to that's going to help me run this farm? In my situation, when I first started in 1995, I was driving a 1985 Caprice Classic. And as big as that trunk was, it really wasn't conducive to selling vegetables at a farm market in New York. So my dad made the deal with my brother and I. You guys can take the big truck on Saturdays, but in exchange, you guys need to take care of the oil changes for the whole year. And that was a pretty good deal. So those kind of resources, you'll find a lot of farmers or landowners are willing to work with you for stuff like that. So keeping the considerations, you need to keep your mind open to that. And then future earning potential. Realistically, you're going to have to say, what can this farm offer me? And you have to, Keith is going to get into this a little bit later, but there's ways to figure that out. What can I realistically get out of this farm? And does that help meet my personal and business goals? Or is it going to meet my personal and business goals? All right, so defining the goals. What do you want your life to be like? Who here wants to work a lot? If the answer is no, then this may not be the course for you. Work-life balance. So this is the one I've had the biggest difficulty with. I like to work, and when I was single, that was no problem. When I was engaged, that was not so much of a problem. When we had our second kid, my wife said, hey, you can't work 20 hours a day and expect that I'm going to watch these kids and raise them. It's not fair to me, it's not fair to the children, and you have to figure this out. So that's been a work in progress, but that is something you definitely you have to consider. Your family goals, that's sort of what I was just mentioning. If it's just you, all you have to consider is you. But if there's more than just you, you have other folks that have to be part of this equation. What's the business going to be? There's a ton of hobby farms, and that's fantastic. But a hobby is a hobby if you have to have income from somewhere else. Is it going to be part-time and it's making some money? Or is it going to be full-time and you're looking at this to support your lifestyle? And then again, if you have other people in your life, it's got to support their lifestyle too. I mentioned before, you've got to make sure your business and personal goals are compatible. Is it going to support your lifestyle? So you've got to consider housing, obviously, education, your own, and then perhaps your kids. Or do you want to save for college? Health insurance. When we met with the Craft Group, which is a group of new farmers or beginning farmers, that was the number one concern that they expressed. Boy, we really want to farm and we can make money at this, but boy, health insurance is really expensive. Good health insurance is even more expensive. And then lastly, there's the case of transitioning between generations. That's the succession planning. We'll get into that in a different course. But if you're dealing with a landowner who's kind of thinking of their exit strategy, That's a different conversation with perhaps different goals, maybe longer term goals, and eventually you'll be that person. So you need to start to think, even as you're beginning the farm, one of the things that was expressed to Cindy and I, when you start the farm, you should think about, what would my exit strategy be? Do I want to exit and sell this farm and that's how I cash out, or do I want to start a 401k, or how do I want to plan for my future?
So Chuck raised some serious issues about finances. So we need to talk about money and whether you have sufficient funds for the goals that you've set. Moving on from goal setting, it's important to fully understand your current financial situation. This is key to your ability to plan for access and tenure. You should know and understand where you are financially. How much do you own in assets? How much do you owe to others? And what is your ability to take on additional debt? We'll explore these issues and more and work with some of the documents that are in your packet during the financial assessment workshop to get a better understanding of where you are financially. Beginning any venture requires financial resources. Keith will help you understand how to measure your current financial standing and what other financial resources might be available to you in the next workshop.
All right, this is where we're going to go. Future earning potential. I said this already. Realistically, you've got to figure out how much can this business generate for you. Is that going to work for your personal goals and your business goals? Are you going to need off-farm income? Back to me, when I started out, I didn't, but I was okay to live at my parents' house, and my mom was willing to cook for me every night, so that was great. When I was about to be married, my wife said, we're not living at your mom's house, and your mom's not cooking for us every night, so you're going to have to figure this out. So I did require off-farm income at that point. Can the business pay back borrowed funds? So any business, you're likely to borrow funds at some point. Farming, because the income is so somewhat unpredictable, it is very common, even for established farmers, to borrow money. But but that gets into a pretty serious proposition pretty quickly. So you've really got to figure out, is this business able to pay back what I'm about to borrow? All right. So we've gone over a few things. Different types of land tenure. Where's it at? Who's got it? Goal setting. Now the goal setting probably you should think about before you sign on the dotted line to rent, lease, or buy a piece of property. You've got to really understand your financial position today, and then the future earning potential. Where do you need this business to be 1 year, 2 year, 5 years, 10 years from now in order for that to meet your personal and business goals? And then the other thing that we really need to impress upon folks is the practical experience or exposure to farming. If you haven't done it at all yet, and you want to get into a farm business, we would highly recommend that you either work sometime on an existing farm. You get a part-time operation. Farmers are always looking for help. Volunteer, apprenticeship, any way that you can get a little hands-on experience, even if it's just for one season, to really understand what's the work that it needs to get done here, what's the time commitment, and how does this kind of all fit into my life, my lifestyle. So we always recommend if you can get any kind of hands-on experience, take advantage of it. All right. So without further ado, we talked about a lot of things tonight, but finances are key to it, and that's the focus of tonight's presentation is financing, getting started, building a business, and eventually moving on. When we were given this training, it was suggested to Cindy and I that we could put on a 2-hour financial presentation. And as flattering as that is, that would be something like saying that Cindy and I could teach you to fly after we watched a YouTube tutorial. So we very quickly realized that we needed to bring in the big guns and get a professional to do this part of it. So we were lucky enough to know Keith Dickinson, who is with Farm Credit East. For those of you who don't know, Farm Credit is a nationwide nationwide ag services company. Farm Credit East is based in the Northeast and with 2 offices in New Jersey. They specialize in agricultural lending, whether it be for buying the farm, buying equipment, infrastructure needs. If it's for a farm, they handle lending for it. Keith is a business consultant and certified professional planner with Farm Credit. His territory includes New Jersey and the southern Hudson Valley area. His specialty is business planning, profitability analysis, business management, and succession planning. Probably most importantly, Mr. Dickinson lives on his family farm in Cumberland County, so he knows the secret farmer handshake. The information that you're going to be getting tonight from Mr. Dickinson is coming from one of the best, and we made the arrangement so that he could be here tonight, provide this service at no charge to our attendees. But you should know that Farm Credit is a private company, and if you like what you hear and you contact Keith next week, at some point he's going to have to start the clock. But so just so you know. And without further ado, we have Mr. Keith Dickinson.
So what I'm going to be covering tonight is it's business management, business finance 101. We're not going to get into too deep on, and the principles we talk about are going to be very applicable whether you were, running a pizza shop or running a, multi-million-dollar farming business. And so just keep that in mind. Now, is our clicker working? Okay, went the wrong way. So I'll introduce myself. I had a good introduction there to start. Keith Dickinson's my name. I work for Farm Credit East. Been with Farm Credits for a little over 5 years, going on 6 years now. Prior to that, I spent 16 years working in the cooperative extension world. I spent 6 years, the most recent 6 years of that tenure with Penn State University, primarily in Southeast Pennsylvania, doing ag finance education. A lot of that time was focused a lot on dairy. Anyone who's driven through Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, if you throw a stick, you're going to hit a dairy farm, and that's what I did a lot of work there, but more in general work as well. I did spend 10 years in Virginia. About 2/3 of that time I was an agronomist. That's what my undergraduate background is. So soil science, plant science. It was an area, north central Virginia, about 45 miles outside of Washington, D.C. We had a good eclectic mix of different types of industries, smaller, what I would call more lifestyle farms, and then quite a few full-time operations. It was beef cattle country, horse country, and then we had wine country, a lot of vineyards in that area as well. And then transitioned during my time there to business management. And before that, I was a farm kid in Cumberland County, New Jersey, right on the Cumberland-Salem line. Closer to Dover, Delaware than Philadelphia, but you have to swim real good to be able to get there across the bay. And I live in our farm is the traditional farm model, the family operation. I live in the house my grandfather's grandfather bought in 1870, and he moved from a quarter mile down the road. So our family's been farming some of that ground for 6-7 generations. But before I get into my section, I want to touch on something that was in the last presentation. Do not discount the value and power of leasing a farm. Through those, especially in my years in extension, I got lots of calls, particularly in Virginia, from what I would call, I just bought a farm and now I want to learn how to make it profitable. And that was the opposite direction. We should figure out how to make it profitable before we buy it so that we have the right thing. Plus, the power of leasing. We can lease farmland dirt cheap in New Jersey. When I worked in Pennsylvania, just across the river, we had dairy farms renting cropland for over $500 an acre, $600 or $700 an acre in some cases. There's a lot of land you can rent for zero. Just qualify them for farmland assessment, and they will be happy. And that's a great opportunity. In our family farm, we've got farms that we've been renting for multiple generations, at least 50 years. I'm 45 years old. There's ground that we rent. I have to remind myself that we don't own it because it's not. We've been renting it ground, and my grandfather started renting. My dad took over, and then when that person died, we rent from the heirs. So those sorts of opportunities do exist. But certainly, all the discussion about having a well-worded lease, you can be very creative in how you word a lease. Some of the work that I do, which I didn't mention, I'm a consultant with Farm Credit. I'm not a loan officer. I can't approve or deny a loan for you, but I do quite a bit with the loan officers on helping help our customers develop plans for those new ventures or those new purchases. And but the point I was going to, I do work with some folks on leasing within the consulting practice, and I've seen just about every nuance you can imagine in a farm lease at some point or another. So you can have purchase options in there, you can have first right of refusals built in there. You can put a lease that sticks to the deed so that if the property's sold, you can still lease the property. So there are lots of options when it comes to leasing. So I just wanted to reemphasize that point, is don't make the mistake of feeling you need to own it before we can do anything with it, because that's a mistake that a lot of folks make. So that's me. There we go. So what are some of the factors that affect tenure decisions? A little bit of a review. Certainly those personal and business goals. I'm a planner by nature. Everything starts with a goal. Everything starts with where do we want to be? If you've ever read, the Stephen Covey material from a ways back, he has one of these, the 7 habits of highly effective people is start with the end in mind. And he's talking about having well-constructed goals, smart goals, specific, measurable, achievable, rewarding, and they have a timeline. Make sure your goals fit that criteria. Knowing your current financial position, and that's where we'll go real quick with the balance sheet discussion. What do you need for your business? Capital. If you're going to go work with a lender, they're going to be throwing words out like capital. That's stuff. That's just another word for stuff. And it's stuff with a dollar sign attached. What's it going to cost? And quite honestly, get down to it, what's the earning potential of your business? What can you make off of it? Answer some of those questions, whether the on-farm, this farm is going to support its own weight, or if we're going to need some off-farm income to keep it going for a short period of time. Many of the small to medium farms that I've worked with through the years needed an off-farm paycheck, whether it's the primary operator operating with that paycheck, or whether it's a spouse. That question about health insurance. That's why that's why we marry a school teacher when we're a young farmer, right? Because that's like the perfect model. We marry a school teacher, they give us health insurance, they got great benefits, and they get the summers off so they can help us during the busy season. So I can't tell you how many farmers I know that was part of the criteria. I want to marry a school teacher. Or they drive, a young couple that's going that route, they sort of drive their careers that way, because it fits, it really does. In fact, when I was young, we hired some school teachers to work on our farm during the summer. That's before they got paid well enough to where they didn't have to work during the summer. But I spent when I was like 10 years old, I rode on a tomato transplanter side by side with one of my school teachers. That was an interesting sort of arrangement, but it works. And we're going to talk about all these points here. And I'm going the wrong way. There we go. So what are some of those situations? These land tenure situations come with financial obligations. If you own property, if you own property or lease property, there's a financial obligation along with it. This is just a little bit of refreshing from what we just talked about. It's important to understand both what it costs to buy, lease, and even inheriting the land. Now, we're fortunate that on the inheritance side of things, that if you are fortunate to have someone in your family that would leave you some property, that the tax side of that, the inheritance tax or the estate tax side of it, has gotten much more favorable in New Jersey and on the federal side here in the last few years. But so that part, the costs there are not as much, but sometimes we inherit land and we have to buy out a sibling or a cousin or a third cousin or a former spouse, those sorts of things. So there's costs to inheriting land sometimes. And then you have the maintenance costs. We have all those wonderful taxes we have to pay. Certainly, we have to do some reinvestment into the property from time to time. We put up a nice barn, and 15 years later, suddenly it's not nice, it's so new anymore, and we have some expenses there. And then all these hidden costs, the property tax, insurance. We're going to touch on that in a little bit more detail. And what resources, not just thinking through understanding the cost, but also understanding what resources do you have available. Is it just your paycheck? Do you have equity in your home that's available for generating some capital towards your purchase, or your lease for that point? We talked about all farm income. Do you own a vacation home that has some equity in it? Would you be willing to sell that vacation home in order to explore your dream? All those are the questions that you need to think through when you're in the planning stage there. And I'm probably going to get 3/4 of the way through before I figure out what's up and down on this clicker. I'll just warn you now. I'm used to the side by side. So where are you today? Where do you want to be? That's your goals, and how will we get there? What will get you from here to there? That's what we're talking about. That's a business plan in the shortest form. Every business plan should answer these questions. Where are you today? Where do you want to be? And how are you going to get there? And when you're working, if you're going to approach a lender to invest in your business, and think of that a lender is loaning you some money and it's an investment in your business. They expect you to pay back because they expect to get a return on that investment. And that's the interest that you pay. And so if you're going to encourage a lender or any other entity to invest in your business, you need to be able to explain this in the shortest fashion possible. One of the mistakes that folks make is they take a seminar on business planning and they come in with a business plan that comes in a binder like this. Don't ever do that. You should be able to tell your story in just a few pages. And most of those pages should be the financial statements that we're going to talk about tonight, particularly when you're working with a lender. These loan officers are getting dozens, if not hundreds of requests per month. They simply don't have time to read through your binder. You need to be able to communicate quickly and effectively. So if you remember nothing else, remember that part of when you get to that planning stage, you should have that detailed plan for your own use, but have the executive summary that you can take with you to those folks that you want to invest in. We've heard about the elevator pitch, right? Being able to tell somebody in the time it takes you to go 3 floors in an elevator, you should be able to explain your business concept in that period of time as well, because that's about the attention span that you have with somebody that's potentially going to invest in there. So I know we said hold questions at the end, but I don't do it that way. Any questions up to this point? Okay. Balance sheet. Balance sheet, one of your 3 core financial statements. The balance sheet starts with your assets, your stuff, things that you own, that you have legal title to, that's yours. So before we get any deeper, and there's a balance sheet handout in there, so you can go ahead and start pulling that out in your folder. What's some examples of some assets? House, retirement accounts. Anything else? Car. Savings. Savings is the best because it's cash. Cash is great because you can do anything you want with cash. What's the problem with trying to use a 401k or an IRA account as collateral on the loan?
Can it draw?
What's that?
Can it draw?
You can, but what's it cost you? Yeah. So if if the withdrawal would kick you into the 30% tax rate, plus plus state tax, plus the 10% penalty, you pretty much give back half of it. So to get that $100,000 out of a retirement account, you got to take $200,000 out. Plus, it's just not a good idea. I'm a financial planner. I'd say you got to save as much as you can for retirement. Otherwise, be really, really nice to your kids. And if you don't have kids, have them, because they're going to have to take care of you. It took me a while, but we have 3 kids under 5 and under at home, so That's why I'm going to be working until I'm 70. So assets, stuff that you own. Don't forget the IRAs, 401ks. Put it on your balance sheet, but realize that a lender's going to look at that and put a little circle around it. You know, if that's the bulk of your net worth, it's not worth as much as the cash or the equity in the home or something like that. Something the lender, because worst case scenario for the lender is they have to take that, they have to foreclose because you weren't able to pay your obligations. They have to pay back their bank, people they borrowed money from, and they get that through the equity in your home or the equity in your cash or whatever it may be. But if you've already started doing some of the, that leased farm, think of the things that you can do to build equity while you're leasing the farm. Building up a big pile of cash is one of the first pieces of advice I always give, is don't spend every dollar, pile up some cash. That's your rainy day fund. But also some of that farm equipment that you need, build that up. These are all assets that you can put on your balance sheet. The vehicles. I like the idea of having the 10-year-old Caprice Classic or whatever it is. I've never bought a new car in my life. I like old used stuff because of that bloody D word that we talk about here in a little bit, that depreciation. Your investment accounts, if you do have, do some investing, don't forget about those. And the other one that we always ask for on our balance sheet that people take a while to look up is, maybe you have some life insurance and it's a cash value to it, because that's something that you can tap as well. So don't forget about those things when you're putting that balance sheet together. And then we subtract out the liabilities. What do you owe? So what are some examples of liabilities? Student loans, credit cards, mortgage. Do you pay cash for your car? I do. I pay cash for my car. I don't like car loans. But car loans, yeah. Car loans, equipment loans. Don't forget family debt. We look at that a little bit. That's another one we circle sometimes on the balance sheet, but it's real debt. We borrowed some money from mom or dad or grandmom to, get us through college or do that. And it sort of has a informal repayment arrangement, but it's still there. Don't forget to put it on the balance sheet. Credit cards, certainly. And don't forget the HELOCs, the home equity lines of credit. My loan officers gripe to me sometimes is, we got this package together and we were close to the finish line, and we pulled the credit history and we saw the home equity line, and that put them back over the edge of not being able to qualify. Because just because you have a low balance on that home equity line, it's still the entire maximum that you are able to draw on that is considered against you in terms of potential debt. Just like a credit card, the credit limit is what's considered, not the entire balance. The balance at the moment is important, but also what's the potential debt. If you have $5,000 on credit card debt, but those credit cards have a limit of $50,000, that's what the loan officer has to consider, because that's the potential debt you could get into without any reconsiderations from their end. So don't forget that stuff. Make sure you put it all on there. So then we subtract those two off, we get to your net worth. Your net worth that's the bottom line. That's your share. We say the debt, liabilities are the bank share. The net worth, you also hear the word equity, that's your share. And figuring out that ratio is pretty important. So we're going to do that. So look at this sample balance sheet that we have up here. We see we have, a nice little blend here, pretty basic balance sheet. $3,000 in savings, $10,000 on a car, $100,000 in real estate, $113,000 total assets. Balanced against that is $1,000 on credit cards, $50,000 on a mortgage, $51,000 for an equity, a net worth of $62,000. Somebody that's good with a calculator or good at math in their head, tell me what's the percentage net worth? Anybody want to ask how you would calculate that? Yeah, there we go. That divided by that. What percentage of their assets is their net worth? About 55%. all right? They own about just over half of that, all right? Because 50% would be what, 124,000. So, no, I did that wrong. Half of that would be the other way. But yeah, you see where we're going. So they're just over half. So is that a strong percentage net worth? It's not bad, but it's not strong. You know, think 60% or above, that's strong. And the flip to that, and what lenders often look at, are debt to asset ratio, which is 100 minus that number. You know, the ratio between debts and assets. So this person is about 45% debt to asset, 40% or less is getting on the strong range. That means there's a lot of meat on the bone in terms of your assets. There's additional borrowing, there's additional equity there. And once we get up to that, down into that 20% range of debt to asset, then, or excuse me, 80%, we're getting pretty risky and it's hard to find. That's when the FSA folks come in, right? Because most conventional banks are not going to be able to approve that loan because it's too risky. Think of what happened in 2008. You know, home values went down by 20, 30, 40% in some cases. So if you're below, you know, a certain range on that, suddenly you're underwater on your home, and just because the market tanked on you. So those are some of the things that banks have to protect against. And since 2008, the banks have to be much more restrictive because of some of the rules, the regulations that were put in place to prevent another 2008 crisis. So just be aware of that. So give yourself a realistic view of where you stand before you walk in the door. So I jumped ahead. There's your net worth percent, 55% net worth. So now go into your folder there. There's a sample balance sheet. Pull that out, and we're going to just take 5 minutes. Start putting your best guess estimate of your numbers on any of those categories. If you haven't done it, take 30 seconds and calculate your net worth for just what you have there. It may not be complete. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but is the number positive? That's a question to ask. If the number's not positive, we've got a ways to go before we're going to qualify to borrow much. Let's just be perfectly honest. If the number's positive, it's a matter of relatively how positive it is. I know, I heard the word student loans. That causes a lot of folks to have a negative net worth for quite some time because, I paid 5 years out-of-state tuition. Fortunately, it was in a state that out-of-state tuition was not too terrible. But I know all about student loans and getting that burden off your back. So that's definitely a consideration. So think about that. That's just that assessing where you are today and knowing what your net worth is today and realizing that until you get that equity, if we're looking to borrow, till we get that equity to a healthy position, our borrowing options are going to be limited. And while we're negative, even the folks from the government-supported borrowing is going to have a tough time lending to you just because there's no meat on the bone. Equity is meat on the bone when it comes to borrowing money. Does that make sense? Everybody, it's not that tough, really. This is basic. This is 6th grade math that we're doing tonight. So percent net worth divided by your assets. I had this practice that. Very important financial ratio. Like we say, the lender's requirements may vary. And it may vary, varies even depending on what type of borrowing you're planning to do. If it's secured debt with a fixed interest rate, it's going to have a more strict requirement than unsecured debt. Unsecured debt is sort of like a line of credit. Credit cards are unsecured debt. That sort of borrowing may do that. But any mortgage is a secured obligation. Most commercial banks are looking at somewhat of an 80% loan to value sort of calculation. And if there's not quite enough within the within the existing asset, but usually within the existing asset, that means a 20% down. You've all heard, 20% down on a mortgage, that's where that comes from, 80% loan to value. To go below that, you're having to get some sort of special considerations. You need a guarantor. Now, the FSA folks didn't mention when they were up here, but they also, not only do they direct lend, but they also have a guarantee program, and we're one of the partners. Other commercial banks are partners with them, to where if there's if there's a loan that doesn't quite meet the underwriting requirements that we have, for lending directly, we can sometimes get a guarantee from FSA that will help get that loan over the hump, so that we can do stuff with them. So, but that percent net worth, know where you are with that before you go to the bank, because they're gonna ask for it, and they're gonna be looking at that. It's one of the main numbers they're looking at. Any questions on balance sheet? Pretty clear how you make it better, right? Don't borrow, spend down debt, pile up cash. And it's beyond the scope to a certain extent of this workshop, but there is some balance within the balance sheet with how the assets lay down. You see on this basic example, you have current and non-current assets. Current assets, just definition, are current assets and liabilities are, on the asset side, it's cash or something that can be turned quickly into cash. So bank accounts, open security account, investment accounts that aren't, locked up in a retirement account of some sort. Those are current assets. Current liabilities, those are debts that are due today or will come due within the next 12 months. So, mortgage, we look at we'll put the principal payments due on a mortgage within the next 12 months on that. We won't put the interest. Interest doesn't go on the balance sheet, but we'll put the principal portion of your mortgage payment that's due in the next 12 months on that. The principal payment on your car loan that's due in the next 12 months, the student loan in the next 12 months, the principal portion that goes in there. We'll look at, credit card debts. The entire balance goes on that because that's always 100% due, but you only have to make the minimum payment. But that balance we put 100% belongs on there. If you are starting to run a business, we'll put inventory on the current assets, and we'll put, accounts payable, bills that if you've bought on credit, any bills that you have, that goes on there. That's looked differently than the hard assets down below, which are and we even go a step further with our balance sheets. We divide it into intermediate and long term. Long term is real estate. Intermediate are equipment, livestock, vehicles. The 401ks end up in the intermediate, although we talked about that. That's kind of a special asset when it comes in terms of how a lender would look at it because of the fact it has baggage associated with it. So that's how that works out. So now we're going to switch to a couple other of our main financial statements. We'll start off with the income statement. So the income statement. This is also called profit and loss statement. If you use QuickBooks as your software, that's what QuickBooks calls it. Earnings statement, P&Ls, you'll hear P&Ls discussed, profit statement. These are all synonymous. The basic formula is income minus expenses equals net income. We'll also hear net margin. We're talking about profit. And it's pretty basic. When you sell more than you spend, it's a profit. It's a positive. If you spend more than you sell, it's a negative. It's a loss. And when you're planning a new business, and this sort of statistic goes, this is a good place to talk about this. Most new businesses, startups, new ventures, new enterprises within an existing business, do not show a profit on average until somewhere between the third and the fourth year. On average. And that's all businesses, all industries. My experience for, 20 plus years now of working with farm businesses, new farm businesses fall right into that trend. And coincidentally, most new business ventures fail within the first 3 years. And the failure was that they did not appropriately account for the fact that they might not make money until the 4th year, so they have to have either that big pile of cash that I'm talking about to get them through, or they've got to have some other source of income, the off-farm job we're talking about, something to get through that. It's very rare that I put together a projection for a new business venture that doesn't show some sort of a negative number or, at best a break-even number in the first year or two, if it's truly a new venture. Just because there's these startup costs, if it's something, especially if we're selling direct to the public, we got to build a customer base, all these sorts of things that come in. That's just on the income side. On the expense side, we got to figure out what we're doing. We make mistakes, and that turns out in wasted money, expenses that we that we get more efficient with. And I'll say how that shows up in the income statement here in a bit. But I wanted to insert that here, and this is an appropriate place to do that because we have to have those realistic expectations when we're developing the financial plan. If you walk in with a plan that says new venture, we're going to net $100,000 this year on $400,000 of sales, they'd be impressed if you pulled it off because no one in their history has done it, right? Because that's a 25% profit margin, and national average profit margin in agriculture is somewhere between 2 and 3%. Now that's a whole bunch of farms that are losing money balanced against some farms that are making money. My experiences, successful businesses are somewhere between 5 and 10% long-term average net margin. That's what we tend to see. So that can help you, scope and scale your business goals as well. And of course, this should be blatantly obvious, but you need that positive net income to be able to afford a farm. If we're going to buy it and we're relying on the business to make the payments, we got to have a profit. Pretty basic. In your, before I do the handout, let's do this. Some terminology: fixed costs and variable costs. Income is income, right? We know that. It's money that somebody gives you for something. Some is because you sold something, some is because you participated in a program of some sort, whatever. But income we don't get too nuanced with, but we do get a little nuanced with our expenses. We have those fixed costs, and I say this is the cost that exists whether you sell, one tomato or, 1,000 tons of tomatoes. Things like overhead expenses. Expenses are just the cost of being business. We got this little trick we use to help remember some of the big ones. It's called dirty. Fixed costs are dirty. Depreciation. I'll get back to that one. Interest. Everybody knows what interest is. Repairs. Stuff breaks. The minute you buy it, it's going to break. I guarantee it. Taxes and insurance. These are some basic fixed expenses that nearly every business has. Some of the others that go in there would be advertising. If we have overhead salaries, they would go into that. Overhead salaries would be if we're paying a bookkeeper. Professional fees, they go in there. Those are some of the other things, but these are usually the biggest ones. Depreciation. We know what depreciation is, right? Everybody heard that thing when you buy the car, you drive it off the lot, it's worth less than when you got it. That's what depreciation is. Now, you'll read about tax depreciation. Now, under our tax code, we can depreciate stuff very rapidly. In many cases today, we can buy an asset, we could buy a new tractor, and we could write off 100% of the expense in the first year under the Section 179 section of the tax code. But we can also, at most, under the tax reform rules, that tractor gets fully depreciated in 5 years. Now, if you're buying a tractor to use in your business, I hope that your plan is that it's going to last you more than 5 years. I usually use 12 years when I'm depreciating a tractor to depreciate out the economic value of it. Now, again, I have tractors on my farm that my grandfather bought in 1948. The one's it's not running at the moment. I used to brag it's running at the moment. It's not running right now because one of the wheels finally rusted out. So it's on blocks right now till wintertime until we fix that. But we also have plenty of tractors, about half of the tractors on our farm are older than me, and I was born in 1972. So they lasted longer than that, but they're fully depreciated. The only value that's left on them is that salvage value, what we're going to get for them. We've gotten the useful life out of it. And that's what this depreciation number is in there. It's a very important number to track. You never write a check to depreciation, well, until you get to this R number when we're starting to put repairs in. But it is a very important number to track before we say we've made a profit in a business because of the fake rust, the rust syndrome. We'll buy some assets and we'll be chugging along and we'll think we're putting money in the checkbook and we think we're doing pretty well. And then all of a sudden the tractor blows up and we got to replace it. If we have not accounted for the fact that that tractor is wearing out and that we are going to replace it someday, and we thought we're profitable without accounting for that, we suddenly find out with that stark realization that we were not profitable as we thought we were when it comes time to replace that tractor. Because, oh, by the way, that stuff's going up too, and appreciation, inflation on farm equipment is this funny little dynamic. When the farm economy is doing well, the inflation rate on equipment will go up very high, and sometimes it's counter cyclical to the general economy inflation. We have some weird dynamics that go on with that sort of thing. Because some of it's driven by supply and demand. When the farm economy is doing well, more farmers are buying new equipment, so suddenly it goes up, and then the price of steel goes up in Korea, and all of a sudden we get all kinds of weird stuff going on. So that's our fixed costs. And these are the ones that, like I say, no matter how much we're operating, we have to account for that somewhere. Now, the nuance between whether we're renting or buying property has to do with which fixed cost is our expense. The interest expense would show up in your fixed expense. The principal payment is after profit. I'll explain that a little more in a bit when we get the full layout. But if we're paying rent, the rent is an expense of the business. So one of the reasons I say, don't discount rent, because if we're paying a substantial amount of rent and our business is generating a positive net income, that's given us a little bit of confidence that maybe we're, not too far off on having a profitable business when it comes to purchasing. Variable expenses. These are the ones that go up and down with the volume of product that we're producing. So if I'm going to use a livestock, I know we have a mix of folks who are interested in livestock and raising crops. So I'll use a livestock example first of some of the things we'd see there. Feed, veterinary expense, bedding expense, breeding expense if we have breeding fees. Those sorts of things are variable costs. If we're if we're raising one cow, it costs this much for the feed. If we're raising 20 cows, we have 20 times the feed cost, roughly. If we're raising tomatoes, we have things like fertilizer. If we're it's commercial fertilizer. If we're conventional, if it's organic, it's some sort of a soil amendment we're putting down. We got seeds, plants. I saw your hand. I'll get it to you. Stuff like that. Those are our. The more we grow, the higher it goes. So you had a question? Oh, you didn't? I thought I saw your hand. Corner of my eye played a trick on me. So those are going up and down. And of course, and it's COGS. Anybody know been around some business accounting to see what COGS is? Cost of goods sold. So if we're in a retail business, we have this cost of goods sold. That's generally the generally accepted definition are things we're buying and then we're marking them up and reselling them. Right. So if we're in a retail business, we may be growing a certain amount of our product, but we may be buying some canned goods to go along with it if we're doing the tailgate markets, or we might be buying some, we had a crop failure in our tomatoes this year, so we're buying some from the neighbors to supplement our own crop, because everybody, if you're selling vegetables in New Jersey, everybody expects you to have a Jersey tomato. The Jersey sweet corn seems to be not as quite as a must as it was, but everybody needs to grow a tomato. I don't know why it is. Well, I do. I mean, I used to raise tomatoes, so there is something special. Because I tried to buy tomatoes in Virginia. They didn't know how to grow them. So this is this is the format for the income statement that I like to use. There's different ones out there. In our consulting practice, Farm Credit, we are very adamant about using what we call the 5-line income statement. Your typical income statement will just have 4 lines. Will be the income, variable expenses, fixed expenses, net margin. Some will only have two. Income minus expenses equals net margin. That's the minimum you need. But we add this gross margin. That's a powerful number when you start to use it to analyze your business. And again, getting too detailed into it's beyond the scope of what we're here for tonight, but I want to explain some of the power of it. When you know this gross margin, and if you can compare that to other businesses within that same industry, you can get yourself a good measure of where the challenges in your business are. If your gross margin is strong, that's telling us that you're doing a good job on converting the input costs of growing a crop, I'm going to use a crop example, to generating sales off of that. If this is deficient, that tells us we need to work on our operational efficiency up here. That tells us we need to work on doing a better job at getting a good crop yield or getting a better price for our product. This issue, because it's fixed, is one that I'm sure we've all heard at some point the term economies of scale. Economies of scale do not work that well up here, but they can work wonders down here. Because remember that fixed cost. If we buy, that tractor that we buy, that 50 horsepower tractor, that has a certain amount of acres that it can handle on an annual basis and be useful. If that acreage is 500 acres and we're running it on 5 acres, it still costs us the same in terms of basic fixed cost to own that asset as it does if we were running on 500 acres. So that's the economies of scale. If we can stretch that production, those fixed costs over a larger set of income, then this percentage that our fixed costs are, that's eating a lot less dollars of those sales. So that's the economies of scale. Economies of scale, you get a little bit of influence on the variable expenses. We can save on seed, we can save on fertilizer if we buy in bulk, but the relative savings there are not nearly what they are when we get into the, being able to be most efficient with these fixed expenses. And the ratios vary a lot by specific ag industry, but I usually look at this gross margin of being, for all industries, of being at least 30% or higher in a profitable business, and these fixed expenses of being of your income, as I should mention, 30% or higher of your income, and this being 15% or less of your income. So we subtract, if I say 30% minus 15%, that gives me a 15% net margin. That's a very healthy net margin. And you can see how if we've got a 30% gross margin here, but we have a 30% fixed expense, that leaves us a 0 net income. And that's where I see a lot of times the small startup businesses, these fixed expenses, the minimum amount of fixed expense that we throw into something to generate one widget out of income, sometimes creates, if we don't have the income to support it, this can overwhelm us with the business. And so, making sure if we're paying rent, it's an appropriate rent. The trade-off with rent a lot of times when we're buying is the interest and the real estate taxes and the insurance that comes with owning, those ownership expenses. That's usually the trade-off that we see. The fixed expense or the principal payment comes out down here, because if we circle back to our balance sheet, none of the items that go on this document show up on your balance sheet. Because the balance sheet, remember, is the stuff you owe, the stuff you own minus the stuff you owe, and it's a fixed point of time. The income statement tells you what happened from one point in time to the other in terms of economic activity on your business. And anything that we use that affects the balance sheet directly is after profit. So a principal payment, think of what that does to our balance sheet. We make a principal payment. Let's say, for simple purposes, we have a mortgage that's a business mortgage that's $50,000 a year. Of that, $40,000 is principal payments. It's pretty far along. We have a balance on our mortgage of $100,000. We make $40,000 of principal payments. We reduce that balance by $40,000. Our net worth has gone up. right? So that has to be after profit because, like I said, these things do not show up on and influence the balance sheet. Anything that influences the balance sheet is directly influence the balance sheet is after that. Does that make sense? That's usually where a lot of folks, if I can usually communicate and explain that interrelationship, we overcome the confusion over what's the balance sheet, what goes on the balance sheet, what goes on the income statement. So think of how this comes into when you're evaluating a business. This is your projection. This is where you're sitting down and trying to figure out, is our business going to be profitable? When we figure out what's our income requirement, we look at let's say we're doing it, but the dream is we want to own this piece of property, and in order to own this piece of property, we need to have a farm that financially supports it. So we know what we get some estimates of what it would cost us to purchase that property through looking at what a potential mortgage might be, this sort of thing. We figure out what our principal requirement would be, we know what our interest requirement would be, and then we get a number down here. And let's say that number is $50,000 a year. So at a minimum, and let's say of that $50,000, $40,000 is principal, $10,000 is interest, just for simple purposes. That means that we need a net margin of $40,000 a year if the business is going to support the mortgage. Everybody see how I got there? So that's where we kind of can go from the bottom up and say, okay, we have a $40,000 profit requirement, and then we're not going to pay ourselves anything yet. This is just paying the mortgage. We're keeping it simple. So we build it from the bottom up, and we say, okay, the taxes on this piece of property will be X. That's easily found. The insurance on that would be X. The repairs we use, we can estimate that. We figure out what our fixed expenses would be. Then we know what our gross margin requirement is. And then we can do some research and says, okay, the industry I'm going in, the average gross margin is 30%. So then we say, okay, what's 30% of that number? And we get to what the sales need to be. So it's a way we can sort of plan it up. And this is the exercise that I go through with my clients all the time when we're assessing a new venture. We break it down to a fairly simple format, and we can do some of this planning. And then we say, well, in the first year we have some startup expenses. Our fixed expenses are going to be poor. Our income is going to be low, but we're anticipating growth, and so we'll start to project these out. If you're starting to do your own projections, make sure you apply that nasty other I word, inflation. Because what these fixed expenses are today are going to be significantly different 5 to 10 years down the road. All right? Particularly, think of the interest rate environment we're in today. Go ahead.
You kind of use a constant of 3% inflation a year?
That's what I use. I use 3%. It's pretty close. The long-term average, I think, is now at 3.1, 2.8, 3.1, somewhere in there. Those of us old enough to remember the early 80s. Now, I was young in the early 80s, but we were in an inflationary environment of double-digit inflation. And so that was a challenging time for businesses because the expenses went up by 10, 20% year to year. Now, those who are, would fall into the millennial category, they're you have not experienced inflation of any real magnitude because we've had very low inflationary environments for the last 10 to 15 years. So it's perspective. But yeah, I use about 3% when I'm doing projections just because it's a best guess average. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but it's better than not calculating anything in there, right? And you'll find that agricultural expenses don't necessarily follow CPI perfectly because we have in the farm economy, we have some unique dynamics that don't translate 100% to CPI, such as tariffs that occur, such as world supply demand, droughts, that whole dynamic that I said, for example, that inflation in the ag economy was actually going up in 2009 and 10, where worldwide in the U.S. it was flat, and even we were borderline deflationary there for a few years in the general economy. But because the ag economy was doing relatively well during that time period, and we're talking big, large use my words correctly, in the overall large agricultural arena, we were doing fairly well during that time period. It sort of was a counter-cyclical inflation sort of thing. Yeah.
So inflation is going to affect your fixed expenses.
Yep.
Variable expenses.
It's going to affect all your expenses, yeah.
Will it also affect your income?
If you've got it structured well, yes. And this is where it depends on what you are growing, what you're raising, what control you have over that income. If you were in a commodity type environment, the answer is probably not. In fact, it's almost certainly not. You know, the price of corn today is very close to what it was 15 years ago. And it's actually gone down by 50% in the last 10 years. Soybeans, same story. Now, if you're raising beef, now if you're adding some value to it through a direct marketed product, through, this is a fresh meat that we're doing and you can name your price, yeah, you can do that. But you have to realize you do have competition and this sort of thing. It's all supply and demand when it comes right down to it. So how much you can adjust that, yes, it should raise that somewhat. The key is making sure that gross margin is level or improving, and then you can handle the fixed expenses through additional sales. Yeah. But like I say, sometimes it fits and starts the way things go, and it's not always a one-to-one. Let me use the farm finance term for what you just said, and that's working capital. You're going to read about working capital in the farm financial publications. You're going to hear a loan officer talk about that. The personal finance equivalent is an emergency fund or a rainy day fund. That's money that you have set aside that does not have a name associated with it, doesn't have a line in the budget associated with it. That's your buffer. That's your buffer against a rainy day, is where that rainy day fund comes in, right? And the rule of thumb in personal finance is 3 to 6 months of expenses. That's the rule of thumb that any financial planner will look at when you're doing a personal budget. Planning your household, your personal emergency fund should be 3 to 6 months. And as an aside, that should be where you start in planning a new business, is get the personal side in order. Get yourself on a monthly written budget at home. Get yourself on a savings plan that gets you that emergency fund, because that good habits will feed right into the business. But there's different rules of thought, but usually it's somewhere in the ballpark of 30% of annual revenue or 50% of annual expenses are where most of the literature will push you. I like either of those. If I can get my clients to go anywhere close to that on working capital, I'm happy, because what a positive working capital will give you, and the way we calculate it is that balance sheet, we take those current assets, we subtract the current liabilities. Remember, current assets are cash or anything that we're going to turn in cash in the next 12 months, subtracted out all the bills we got to pay in the 12 months. If we've got a positive number in that, it's called working capital. Working capital that's worth a third. That means you got a third of your income that can go away. You can have a 33% downturn in your sales and still pay all your obligations for the year. And believe me, with the weather we had this year, we've got guys that are hitting that. It was a challenging year. It was the only year on my farm that I remember having to replant a cornfield because it got flooded out, and 3 weeks later turn the irrigation onto that cornfield. I've never seen that. And then almost get flooded out again 3 weeks later. It was a ridiculous year in terms of weather. But yes, that can a 30% of revenue or half of all your expenses. Just think through that. We can get 6 months through the year without bringing in any revenue. That's a very strong position. To be honest with you, I don't know many farms that are at that position, but I know a few. And that's a good place to be. I have one farmer who's been carrying enough working capital to pay his entire payroll for a full year. And he's in an industry where his payroll is 40% of his overall income. So he's in a good, strong position. And I compliment him on that very frequently, that, he's managing that business in that way. And in fact, he doesn't spend down, he could pull out a big check and buy a bunch of toys with that, but he has good discipline and he doesn't do that. In your handouts, you have a sample income statement. It looks, it's a greenhouse business, I believe. Yeah, Smith greenhouses. This is just a sample one that we use in some of our teachings. And you can see there's a few things there that I want to point out. You're looking at the income statement, you see the total income, you see the variable expenses, you see the gross margin, and then you see fixed expenses. In that example, we have owner salary included in fixed expenses. It sort of depends on your structure. I always do, when I'm preparing one of these, if I have an owner who's actively engaged in the business, I do include their compensation that they're pulling from the business as an expense, because I want that net income to tell me what they have available for reinvestment in the business. I mean, I want that number to give me a good picture. And the argument is, if you weren't doing the work, you're going to hire someone else to do it. So let's put the number on that paper that reflects what you would be paying someone else to do it. Even if you don't take a dime out, let's do that before we say you made a profit, because that's giving us a good solid footing to stand on. But you can see some of the other examples of fixed expenses. So we see a net farm earnings down at the bottom. Now, I'm not going to calculate all the ratios and do all that for you, because we've been doing pretty good on talking about this. But notice that we have cash basis, adjustment, and accrual. Cash basis is what your checkbook tells you. That tells you the checks you wrote that year, that shows you the deposits you made that year. But again, when you're approaching an investor, or when you're evaluating the true profit of your business, you want an accrual adjusted income statement. An accrual is one of these concepts that folks took an accounting class sometime. They talked about debits and credits, and they talked about accrual, and it was just one of those words that we don't remember the meaning to, and it's an intimidating word. I don't even remember what debits and credits are. I just play with the software until it goes the right way, and then I know what a debit and credit is that day. But the accrual adjustment is correct. So what an accrual-based income statement tells you is it tells you the true economic activity of that business within that time period that you're measuring. So if we think of terms of cash basis, we get to the end of the year, we may have inventory on hand. We may have, think of a livestock business. We may have 3 months worth of feed inventory on hand, and maybe at the beginning of the year we had 0. So that's an expense that we want to actually back out of our expense for that year, because it's next year's expense that we spent in this year. So that's an accrual adjustment. We also may have, if we have receivables at the end of the year, we've sold some product, but we haven't been paid for it yet. We want to add that back into this year, and then we want to take whatever our receivables were that came in from the prior year, we subtract them out. The net gives us our accrual number. Same thing, and we can get into some of the tax sort of strategies that we can use. Our income taxes on farms are generally cash-based reporting, so we can prepay some expenses at the end of the year, in which will, on a cash basis, draw our profit down, but on reality, we did have a profit this year. You want to have that accrual number, so you want to go through that exercise. When you're truly just in the planning stage, it's not that hard to do. Once you get into the actual operating the business, then you have a little bit of work to do to make sure the checking account doesn't screw up your actual accrual base, because we didn't pay our bills in the same year as when we incurred it, or we had income that didn't match the year, etc. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay. So that's just an example again. Use this format when you're planning, your projections, your business. This format will help you communicate to an ag lender much easier than some of the other formats you may see out there, because this is the format that they're used to looking at things in. If I didn't mention it in my background, the reason I was in Virginia for 10 years is I went to Virginia Tech for school. Virginia Tech kicked off their game a half hour ago, so I have an incentive to finish on time, so I could maybe just barely get back for the last 2 to 3 minutes of the game. So anyway, that's my incentive to keep going. So we talked about the balance sheet, we talked about the income statement. Those are two of the most important financial statements that you have, and those are the ones that are most commonly looked at by a lender when you're evaluating a business on the long-term, big-term picture. But the next one that we're going to talk about, the cash flow statement, that's also very important, particularly on a year-to-year basis, and especially when you're getting from the dream phase, the planning phase, to the, okay, let's plan, make sure that we can pay all the bills when they need to be paid phase. And so the cash flow statement, what this does, we talked about the accrual adjustments on the accrual-based income statement and the difference between cash and accrual. The cash flow statement is an after-the-fact period that report that lines up with the same period of time that we use for the income statement, which is usually a year. And that tells us where the actual cash came and went. So remember, I said some things like principal payments do not show up on the income statement. It shows up on a cash flow statement. If you are not paying yourself a salary but yet take money out of the business for personal expenses, it doesn't show up on the income statement, but it shows up in the cash flow statement. And when you borrow money, borrowed money is not income. You didn't earn it. Earned income is what goes on the income statement. So when you borrow money, it does not show up on the income statement. The balance on the loan shows up on the balance sheet, but the cash flow statement is where it goes. It shows where the money came from to pay those obligations. So the three main part, your operating activities, this is your income statement that tells you the cash that came in from that. If you have a cash-based income statement, this will line up perfectly. The accrual adjustment, you have to actually unwind the accrual adjustments to get to the cash income from operating to get that. So it tells you what you brought in from the business activities, and that's generally a net number. This is not just your income, it's your income minus expenses, so it could be a positive number, it could be a negative number, depending on the year. And then also the cash flows from investment activities. So an investment activity on a business, that tells you that your balance sheet gives you a clue on that. So if we sell an asset that we own as a business, if we sell, let's say we had a really challenging year and let's say we're a livestock enterprise and we sold a few of our breeding cows. That's cash from investment activity. That was not we don't put it on the income statement because it was not income that we earned. We used up an asset. It actually diminished our future earnings ability to do that, but we did that to pay it. Let's say we have an old tractor that's wore out. We sold that as part of a trade-in on a new piece of equipment. Well, the net would be what is the difference there? So, but it's only the cash that came in and out of the checkbook. So let's say we had a tractor that we sold for $3,000, an old used tractor, and then we bought a new $50,000 tractor. We really upgraded. We would only record the cash that we had to write for that. So probably maybe the trade was our down payment, so that we didn't actually write a cash check to it. And maybe if we did it mid-year, we paid some loan expenses on it. That's where the financing. So that in that example, maybe the only cash is the cash from the sale because we didn't actually write a check to buy the tractor, we financed it. Now, if we wrote a check to buy the tractor, we'd record it there in that investing section. That's something we invested into the business. We bought the farm finally. We bought a piece of property. So the cash flows from the investment activity would include those principal payments on a mortgage. And then the financing activities would be, okay, we have a credit card and we used a credit card to pay our bills in these 3 months, and then we turned around and we paid a payment on that credit card in these months. So that's these are all net numbers. And that just tells you, all it is an informational sort of a statement to tell you where the money went and where it came from. And some of especially when you're, if you've been operating a business for a few years and you're going for financing, some of your lenders may look to see that just to get a better idea of what your cash flow actually looks like on the business. What I call the poor man's cash flow statement is a tax return, because that's usually cash based and it gives you that sort of thing. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on a cash flow statement, because I consider the balance sheet and the income statement to be far superior when we're planning a business. And when we're talking cash flow, the next part is the budget. So just to review before we get to the budget, we talked about the balance sheet. That's your current financial position, or that snapshot in time. The income statement tells what happened during a period of time, and the cash flow it just tells us where the money came from and where it went, to explain why our checkbook balance is different at the end of the year than where it started, and why the number on the income statement does not match the difference. It rarely does. All right. So let's talk budgeting. Who gets up in the morning and say, man, I can't wait to write my budget today? All right, good. Got a fellow nerd like me. I'm one of the things I do every single day, my wife will tell you, it drives her nuts, is as I'm getting ready for, my day, I get my cup of coffee, I sit down in front of the computer, I pull up our personal financial software, and I see where we are in a month for our budget. And we got about a week left in the month, so guess what? Time to start working on the November budget. I am a budget nerd, but I use it to make things happen that I want to happen. Remember all those goals we talked about? A budget is, in my opinion, the most powerful tool that you can use in operating your life and your business. So even if you never end up going into business, if you can manage your life using a budget and always make sure at the end of the month, the end of the year, the money that came in was higher than the money that went out, you're going to be in a better position than you started with. And, I could go through all the, I could get up here and rant for a while about, how poor of a financial management we have in this country. We many, many years have spent more than we brought in as a country. It's a problem. Budgeting is what we need to do. So like I alluded to earlier, the best place to start with a budget is start doing it at home, get that good practice, and then we could do it in the business very easily. But all it is that cash flow statement looking forward. It tells us when our peak cash needs are going to be, and it helps us plan for how we're going to meet those cash needs. Think of a vegetable business. I know several folks here have said that that's something that they're interested in. When do you think the majority of your cash expenditures are? Beginning of the year. March, April, May. You got a huge chunk, all those variable expenses up top, other than your labor, which is kind of scattered throughout the year. 100% of your seed is in the first third of the year. 100% of your fertilizer expenses, usually a lot of your supplies you're buying ahead of time. If you're growing vegetables on plastic mulch, all that was incurred in the beginning of the year. A lot of that expense happens before you brought in a single dime of income, if you're just a truly seasonal business where you're planting in the spring, harvesting summer through fall. And so we have, through our bank and through many other banks, we have lines of credit that many of our customers use in order to borrow money in the spring so they can pay those obligations and then pay it back in the fall when the income comes in. But you need to have a plan for how that's going to happen. Otherwise, employees don't stick around too long on an IOU. So meeting payroll, when you buy that farm, the township isn't real excited with an IOU. I'm fortunate to live in a pretty rural, little more laid back township where as long as you make good by the end of the year, we're okay. We're going to charge you a little interest for the months you missed, but as long as you make good by the end of the year, you're not going on in the newspaper. The township right next to me, if you're a week late, you're in the newspaper. And I know most of New Jersey is more like that neighboring township than the one that I'm lucky to live in. So, we need to plan for those big expenses. And property taxes, of course, is one of the big ones. In fact, if you have a mortgage, your lender is pulling your property tax records once a year. And if it's not satisfied, you're getting a phone call. And if it's not satisfied again, they may pay your taxes and add it to your loan. Because, the township can sometimes get in the way of foreclosure. So we want to make sure that that's out of the way. So that cash budget is critically important. It's just a plan to determine. And I'm a firm believer in a monthly cash flow budget. Yeah, we start with the year, but that doesn't do us any good when it comes to when it comes to actually planning the cash flow of the year. I like to use a month-to-month budget, which you've got in your worksheet. Go ahead and pull it out. It's a 2-pager. And the way this works, it's a top to bottom. These actually stack up. The second page, other page, fits down underneath of the top page. But you can see it's annual, and then January through December, you have your sales categories, you have your labor categories, you have your variable cost categories, you have your fixed costs or overhead categories, including your own draw and needs. And then you look down at the bottom and you see other sources, uses of cash. You have your equipment purchases, you have sales, funds borrowed and funds repaid. So if you're using a credit card or a line of credit, that's where some of that number will come in. If you've got them, yeah, go ahead.
How do you do it like an angel investor? Do you calculate those?
Wherever the money's coming from. That's that. Yeah, there should be another line there. There's not, but another line. That would be another. So if you have an angel investor or something, or that might be grandma. Granny gives you a little cash, and maybe she's the operating loan for the year, right? She gives you a little money, and then you say, well, I'll pay it back at the end of the year, and then she says, don't worry about it, darling, I love you. That's the best angel investor, right? But yeah, all cash sources and all cash obligations. So if that angel investor says, I'll pay you this year, you don't have to pay me back next year, you're going to show more cash coming in than went out. Your income statement might show a loss that year, but you might end up cash positive at the end of the year. And that's in some of those circumstances. But yeah, it just goes in, let's just say in that other sources, uses of cash, there would be an other line in there. We don't see angel investors in farms that often. Well, we do, yeah. The more common example is grandma. But yeah, but a true, where the term comes from, angel investor, I'm starting to see it here and there, but it's not very common. Hasn't become common enough to warrant a permanent slot on the sheet yet. So let's move on to, let's go through this example here. So here we have cash in. We started off, this is our checkbook. We started off with a $10,000 balance in the checkbook. For this time period, let's just say this was a month, we had $2,000 of inputs that we purchased, so now we're down to 8. We brought in $1,000 of sales, we're back up to 9. We sold an old piece of equipment, we're back up to 9,500. We bought this, here's that trade-in. We sold the old tractor, we bought the new used one for 5,000. We're down to 4,500. Well, we got to make payroll next month, so we borrowed 10,000, and now we're up to 14,500. And then we made 5,000 of principal payments. 5,000 principal payments. So now we're down to 9,500. So you can see how this kind of went. This person borrowed money. They might have drawn on their operating loan to get this balance up big enough to pay the same bank the mortgage payment. That happens. That happens quite often. And it's certainly a legitimate use of that operating loan. That's an obligation. So you can kind of see how that was. So our checkbook said that we spent $500 this month, all right? But that's not what happened. This cash flow budget, this cash flow statement tells us the real story. If we just looked at that, we say, we lost $500 this month. It wasn't that bad of a month. But in reality, we borrowed $10,000 that we're going to have to pay back before the end of the year, more than likely. So, this budget is very important for planning that out. And it's also very important for, like, again, when you're planning out that production of your business, knowing when you have these negative months where you have a net cash flow need, and that helps you put together a request for an angel investor, for a line of credit with a bank to say, I need to be able to borrow this much money between this month and that month, and I can afford to pay you back in this month. And that helps you plan that. And of course, the better you plan that, the less interest expense you have, because you're only borrowing the amount you need during the time period you need it, and you're paying it back when you can afford to do so. Any questions on the cash flow? Everybody going to start doing a budget? Yeah. A week away, November 1st. All right, if you're traveling for Thanksgiving, you got to plan for that. If you're doing Thanksgiving at home and you're not raising turkeys, you're probably going to buy one, or if you get the free one from the supermarket, you're doing that. So that's a little, plan more for your grocery budget, plan a little more for the gas budget if you're traveling. If you haven't bought your airline tickets already, you're in trouble. That's it. That's the things to think of. And then, of course, believe it or not, Christmas is happening on December 25th again this year. Yeah, so many people get so surprised. December rolls around. Oh my God, Christmas is this month again. I didn't budget all year. We start budgeting for Christmas in January. We put a little bit of money away each month. We haven't used, I work for a bank, but I'm not real big on debt. I'm not big on debt that's not necessary. My wife and I have not used a credit card and been married, 10 years. And we're still here. We're still here. You can do it, and the big part of that is we have that monthly budget. And I can't stress this enough. If you have a dream of buying a farm, operating a business, and your personal finances are a mess, you got to fix that before you can ever think of taking that next step. Because that mess is going to carry over to the business, and it's going to be a mess with big zeros attached to the end. So get that fixed first. It's going to be good practice for running that business. All right, I'm off. I didn't see a soapbox here, but I think I just was on it. All right, so we're kind of getting to the pulling it all together phase. So figuring out if you're ready. So if you've got a balance sheet that looks good, if you've got an income statement plan that's realistic and shows a profit that can pay your obligations, if you've got good cash flow plan and all that, you're already ahead of the game. That's why we spend so much time on that. So it doesn't matter whether you're going to be renting property or you're going to be borrowing property. The person that's on the other end of that transaction has the same sort of desires. The landlord's going to be sure that you're going to be able to make the payments. They're going to be able to pay the rent. Now, I've already said here in New Jersey, we have a very fortunate circumstance that we can rent land for relatively cheap. We pay, again, I can give you examples. Midwest, we're talking, thousands of dollars per acre on farmland. Whereas here, we're talking a few $100. The best farmland at the highest rent is a few $100s an acre. We can find farmland again for free. It may not be the best farmland, but we can find land available for very little price out of pocket. So in those cases, you may not be paying rent, but those landlords are going to expect you to maybe keep up the fencing, maybe to keep the place looking nice. I remember in Virginia when I worked down there, we had a lot of land that was rented free, but these were beef cattle farmers. They rented the pastures out front, but they had to trim all the fences around all the horse paddocks that were the owners. They had to put fertilizer and lime, not just on their pastures. So they were paying rent, but it was just sort of a gentlemanly agreement rather than a cash rent being paid out. Most of the leases in New Jersey are cash leases. We don't see share leases very often. That we do see them. We don't see, some of those sort of net leases that you read about, but they do exist. But realistically, most of what it is cash paid out. But they're going to make sure that you can do that. You can keep it up. The lender is absolutely going to make sure that you can repay your loan. I mean, that's pretty much it. when the lender's asking you for all these things, but it's just so that they can not just convince themselves, but convince the people up the chain in the bank that we're going to lend this person money and we're going to get the principal and interest back that we require to pay our bills and also pay those who invested in our business. And they both need documentation. If you don't know your credit score, if you're looking to borrow money, you need to know your credit score, you need to understand it, you need to understand how to make it look good. Now, I said I haven't had a credit card for 10 years. We were fortunate. I grew up in the house my grandfather's grandfather built. We don't buy houses over and over in our family, so I received that, free of charge. So I haven't had a loan, until a year and a half ago when a storm blew down all of our outbuildings and I had to rebuild a garage. I hadn't had a loan since I paid off that student loan X number of years ago. So I didn't have a credit score. Some banks, that's a problem. Other banks, okay, we can't give you a quick loan, but we need to do some manual underwriting. That's where these documents are important. And if you don't have a track record with the business and you're wanting to borrow business loans, you're going to have some of this in addition to a good credit score. Lenders want to see those financial documents. The best advice is that first line: be ready. Know the questions they're going to ask. They're going to see those first two financial statements for sure, a cash flow budget most likely. They're going to want to see if you have a track record. They're going to want to see it. They're going to ask for tax returns. They're also going to ask for the information to make the accrual adjustments, because they're not going to evaluate it on tax returns, because we know full well, we do tax preparation at Farm Credit East as well. We know how there can be a drastic difference between what the tax return says and what actually happened in terms of economic activity on that business. So know your financial position, know where you are, know what's realistic, know how much you can repay in your mind. Know what that principal payment's likely to be. Most commercial lending, which a farm mortgage for buying anything that's not a residential mortgage, is going to be considered, and it's for a business, is going to be considered commercial. So whether you're borrowing from a farm credit or some other bank, the longest term you're going to have is about 20 years. So if it's let's say it's $1 million farm, divide by 20, that's what your principal payment's going to be on average per year. And then whatever the interest rate is at that year, divide that in half, and then divide by 20, that's what your annual payment's going to be. Quick and simple, easy way to figure out what you can afford. That's the amount of profit that you need in order to satisfy that loan. And then have all these documents in order. So you're going to need a business plan. Guy that I studied under at Virginia Tech was a guy by the name of David Cole. You'll read, he's kind of known as the guru of ag finance. He's done a lot of publishing over the years on farm finance, especially in the farm credit world. That's a line from one of his publications that he wrote in 1996. I saved it and I still use it today. Business planning, the roadmap to success. And I use this analogy. A business plan is nothing more than a roadmap. Now, I'm of the era when I first started working in a county that I'd never set foot in my life, and I was expected to go out and find farmers in the middle of nowhere. I had this big book that had a map for every corner of that county, and you look through it and everything. And so this analogy worked a lot better then than when I can pull up my phone and do the same thing. But you think about it, a business, when you're planning a journey, you say, well, I want to get there. That's my goal, right? That's my ultimate destination. So your business plan is, I want to be from where I am today to owning a business that is earning a certain amount of money. Some of your goals are not, it's not just that one goal that's at the end. You've got other little points that you have to travel through in order to get that. Now, we're in New Jersey, we're in Trenton, so those of you who are anyone from the western side of New Jersey know that you don't get out of New Jersey without going across the bridge, right? And some parts, you have to drive a pretty good long ways before you can get out of New Jersey. That's why they told you on the way out, right? Because it took you a while to get there. So there are certain barriers to getting to that journey. right? So we have to plan not just to get, like I said, I'm right across the river from Dover, Delaware, but I got to drive an hour to get there. By boat, it's 15 minutes, right? But I don't have a boat, so I have to drive an hour to get to Dover, Delaware. So that's a barrier that you put in there. So these different points, these goals are not just the end goal, but we're putting goals. In year 1, I'm going to get to this point. In year 2, I'm going to get to that point. In years 3, it's putting pins in that roadmap to show how we're going to get exactly from point A to point B. That's what your business plan is communicating to yourself and to whoever you're going to ask to invest in your business, that angel investor that we talked about, or the lender. It's long-range planning. It's very critical for getting financing. I talked earlier, if your business plan needs a binder to hold it together, it's too long to take to a lender. The perfect business plan to take to a lender, the narrative part of it should be no more than the front and back of one page, and then 3 to 4 pages of financials to go along with it. And most of your loan officers, the first thing they're going to do is rip off that cover page and dig right into the financials. Because again, that's their finance people. They're looking at, is this a loan, what are they asking for, and what's the plan to pay me back? Those are the 2 most critical questions that the loan officer is asking for. You're going in there with a stack this fluff of a marketing plan. They don't care. They don't want to run your business. I care because I'm the consultant that tells you it works on that. But yeah. But should be general enough to be flexible, but provide clear direction. Yeah, because I say the best part of a business plan is not the plan that you wrote out, but that last section, which is the contingency plan. Something in that plan is not right. Something is going to go wrong, not go according to plan. The best laid plans of mice and men most often go awry, That contingency plan, thinking ahead of what will likely go wrong, and having a plan for how we're going to deal with it is important. When I help a customer do a financial projection, one of the final steps that I do is at the very bottom, I say, what will this net income look like if income is down by 10%? What will it look like if expenses go up by 10%? And what happens with a 25% change in interest rate? And boy, are my customers glad I did that interest rate discussion, because interest rates have gone up almost 50% over the last year and a half. We knew that was going to happen. It just finally did. So what's in a business plan? Describes who you are, who's your customers, what are you going to do, how are you going to do it. In your handouts, there is a sheet that has the Farm Credit logo on it. It says Plan to Succeed. Has my good friend Erin Piro's name and email address on it. She helped put this together for AFT. This is the format that we all use when we're developing a business plan within our consulting practice. We start with it's a top-down sort of structure. And you can either start with the bottom and move your way up, or start with the top and move your way down. My advice, though, is to start right there at the very top where you have your mission. The mission statement, it should be very simple. What you do, why you do it. Those 2 questions, answers in 1 to 3 sentences at most. What your business does and why you're doing it. Speaks to your values, and it speaks to, very simply, what we're doing. It should be something you should remember. You see you see mission statements, sometimes they're a paragraph and a half long. What good is it to you? Because your mission statement is what should drive every decision that you make in a business. Every decision, that keeps you focused. That's your true north. If you're trying to find directions and you're lost, finding north can help you get somewhere along the way. If you've ever wandered the woods like I have, right? Get into a nice pine forest and try to find your way when every tree is exactly the same and the sun just went behind the clouds. You wish you knew which way. You wish you had that compass and tell you which way north was. But the mission statement is absolutely that. I encourage everyone here, as you're planning your business, work on a mission statement. Don't overthink it. Simple mission statement. One that you can recite just like that. And one that when you have employees can recite just like that, because you want to hire people that are aligned with that mission statement. It should be one of your hiring practices. The mission statement of this business is X. Do you agree with that? Can you support that? If the answer is no, you don't want them on board because they're not going to be helping you. Then under that, we have objectives. You see we have 4 blocks there. I suggest 3 to 4 main objectives. These are main multi-year accomplishments that we want to do with our business. That's where we want, that's that kind of future destination in our roadmap analogy that we're looking at. That's what we want to look at. Again, they all align with that mission statement. They focus in on that. Then goals. I talked about the SMART goals. There it is, spelled out for you. You have goals that achieve those objectives, which then are aligned with your mission statement. Those SMART goals, usually less than 5 years, ideally 1 to 2 years in duration. Some of them will be ongoing, One of your SMART goals might be, achieve a net revenue of 10% of sales on an annual basis. So maybe that's one that's there every year. And then underneath of that is the action plan. And those should be generally what we're going to do in the next 12 months to accomplish that goal. You may have things that are 3 or 4 years out. You can note that, but the action plan really to be most effective is within that, that short period of time. And we're looking at this, that part of this plan gets adjusted every year. If we've done it well, and as long as those objectives haven't changed, as long as the mission hasn't changed, we might not have to touch the top half of that sheet for 20 years. But those goals and those action plans, those are going to be adjusted probably on an annual basis, depending on the circumstances. Maybe we have a goal, a goal is we want to purchase a new tractor. Well, we check that off. 5 to 10 years later, it comes back on there because that tractor wore out. Does that make sense? Use this when you're making your plan. It's a good tool. The only other advice I have on the business plan is, I'm a consultant. I work for hire, and people pay me to help them write business plans. So think of that perspective when I say never pay someone to write your business plan for you. I'm the consultant that comes in, meets with you a few times, suggests some wording, helps you organize your thoughts, maybe writes up a draft of your plan, but then I'm out the door. I'm to the next customer. When the rubber meets the road, you are the one doing the work. You are the one that's going into the lender. You are the one that has to make it happen. I'm long gone. So never pay an outside consultant just to write a plan for you, because those plans go up on the shelf and they're meaningless. Make sure that you are actively engaged. And I insist, whenever I do a business plan engagement with a client, I insist that they are actively engaged, and I give them homework at every time we meet. I say, you're going to send me your goals. You are going to write this mission statement. I'll help you tweak the language. I'll ask you those challenging questions there. Why? How? That's my role. I'm facilitating the discussion. I'm helping you think of what I do mostly in the business planning is I help do most of the work in making those financial projections realistic and making sure they're in an appropriate layout and filling in the blanks. Like the time I had somebody doing a greenhouse business and they forgot to put utilities on the budget. Every greenhouse I've ever been in had a pretty big electric or gas bill associated with it, or a wood bill for the wood-fired furnace ones. So, any questions on business planning before we kind of get into the true, fully wrap-up mode here? Okay, so that's a great question. So a nut crop or, fruit trees. We put a tree in the ground today. We're probably going to get a first late harvest 3 to 4 years after planting. So we have costs. So in our budget, we're accounting for the cost of the tree in year 1, the maintenance costs in years 2 through 3. We're starting to show a little bit of income in 4 or 5. Full productivity is probably 6 or 7, depending on the exact species, whether we're doing high density trellis or conventional or whatever. Wine grapes always used to be 6 years to your first real harvest. Now we've got with some of the better advanced trellising, we can push that. We can get a harvest in year 3, which blew my mind. When I was in Virginia, I was in wine country. I did some of the first budgeting I did was on small wineries and vineyards getting started, and that was always a problem. It was 6 years before you had your first harvest, so you had to spend money. So for the income statement, you prorate the annual expense. The budgeting, you put the actual cash expenditure down there, but you prorate that cash expense over that useful life of that. It's like a depreciable asset. You know.
Help you at all with securing a loan if you have future assets?
Yeah, I mean, that helps you with your future projections. You show future income. It doesn't necessarily help you borrow the money up front if you don't have income to pay it. You know, there's not many lenders that are going to give you terms that, okay, you borrow the money today and 5 years from now you make your first payment. So you still...
Could you grab equity from that if you already have on the ground? And it's in production?
Technically, yes, but realistically, no. Because if it's a mortgage on a property, the only person that thinks that's a valuable asset is somebody who wants to raise fruit trees. All right? If that person buying a property wants to raise horses, that's a liability because I got to push those fruit trees out. So, you know, a vineyard, a fully established vineyard, sometimes we can find, you know, adding some value there because especially if it's a well-established vineyard. A well-established orchard in the Hudson Valley, absolutely. New Jersey, it's a little tougher to get that because, you know, it's a small subset of what our buyers are looking for. You know. Yeah, if you're in Georgia and you have an almond orchard, yeah, you know, pecan orchard, I should say. Yeah, well now, yeah, you know why? Because a hurricane blew them all off the trees. Yeah, Georgia's not gonna have a pecan crop this year. That's why our blueberry prices were excellent a couple of years ago, and peach prices were excellent New Jersey was the #2 peach producer in the country last year because the entire Southeast got wiped out in a freeze. So California was the only one to beat us. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit, and again, we're like 3-4 slides from the very end here. So approaching a lessor, approaching a landlord. You know, be prepared to demonstrate that you're going to be a reliable tenant. They may want references. If you're some guy off the street, they never met you before, they're going to want some character references. They may want a credit report. They may want to see a budget. They may want a legal contract. And if I'm advising either you or the landlord, I'm advising you to get a written lease. An oral lease is as good as the paper it's written on. Think about that. You know, it's worthless. And, you know, again, leasing is a great way to get started. You can be very flexible with the terms of that lease. Go ahead.
Is there good templates for leasing?
USDA has some good stuff out there. Extension has some good stuff out there. You know, I work with folks to help draft stuff. Yeah, don't just walk into an attorney's office and say, draft me a farm lease. First off, they don't work with farm clients. They don't even have a template. But yeah, I mean, there's some good. That book, it's in your packet, has, I think, may even have some templates in it. I'm not sure. I haven't. It does? Okay. I've read it, but it's been a few years, so. I say extension. That was one of the most common questions I got when I worked in extension was we had this old USDA budget that we had made copies of. Yeah, so there's different sources out there. I don't usually find, you know, references maybe to the credit report. That's kind of rare. On a residential rental, you see that. What I see with farm landlords here, they may want to see a budget. The lease, more and more, that's becoming more common because some guys have gotten, especially when we end up, we're seeing a lot more non-traditional ag landowners, especially here north. Folks who aren't, you know, this was a farm they bought and they're renting it to get farmland assessment. You know, they weren't raised on a farm, so they don't trust you. They don't have the handshake agreements, no good for them. Whereas, like I say, you know, our family's been renting some ground for 2 different farms I can think of. We've been renting for at least 50 years and there's never been a written lease on it. So it's just, that was the old style model. That's changing fairly rapidly. Approaching a lender. So again, be prepared with those documents. A lender may want, I'm going to say, will want tax returns. They're going to want some references. Credit report, they're going to pull that. You're going to sign a piece of paper when you put in your application that authorizes them to pull the credit report. They're going to want that business plan, that cash budget, but the business plan is going to include a balance sheet. That's going to include a projection. FSA, if you're going to them, they have their full packet, which includes a business plan form. You have to fill out their form according to that. It's a business plan. And they even require training for their borrowers. I used to teach the training when I was with Extension. So it's very similar to this class, except over 3 weeks. But be prepared. Know the questions that they're going to ask. How are you going to pay this? What's this ding? If you have a ding on your credit report, know what it is and be able to explain it. We have a lot of folks that come in and say, okay, why do you have this? Why did you not pay this debt, or why did this end up getting settled? Well, we had a divorce that year and that sort of thing. Sometimes that that can overcome the bad score. Other times it can't. It all comes down to the full package. So any questions on what to expect when you go into the bank?
When you approach a lender, should you
Yep.
be prepared with your personal financial statements as
Absolutely.
well as the projected
Absolutely.
business statements?
Absolutely. Especially if it's a new business, because your only track record is your personal. Yeah, they're going to see that. And again, if it comes in there, if you have zero track record, your personal is all that really matters, because that's what your equity is. That's what that's what they're going to look at those. They're going to look at those pay stubs and say, okay, if this farm does not produce a dime, do we have a paycheck here? Are you going to keep your job? And if so, is that enough to pay the mortgage? Right? So yeah, absolutely. So that's why, you get your personal house in order first. That will give you progress toward that. Any other questions? Okay. So now I'm just going to go through a few things just to explain who Farm Credit is, what we do, and then I'll be done. So Farm Credit East, Farm Credit East is the part of the Farm Credit system. As was mentioned, we are a cooperative. We are member owned. We're not a stock bearing company. We're not you're not going to be able to buy stock and Farm Credit on the stock exchange, but you can buy stock once you become a member. When you borrow money from Farm Credit, you become an owner. And the Farm Credit system celebrated its 100th year anniversary 2 years ago. There are 69 associations across the country. Some are multi-state, such as Farm Credit East. Some are, Texas, I think, has 2 or 3 associations just within the state of Texas. Nationwide, this is as of 2017, we had $259 billion in total loan volume. We served more than 500,000 customers nationwide and had just under $12 billion in new loans just to small farmers and ranchers in 2017. That's what we do. This is Farm Credit East. You can see that circle are the 3 branches that cover New Jersey. If you're in the northernmost 3 branches of New Jersey, you are associated with the Middletown, New York branch. If you're essentially North Jersey, Flemington, so right now we're in Flemington territory. Monmouth County north is Flemington. Burlington, Ocean County south is Bridgeton, where, and I told you where I live. I live right between that dot and that notch. So I'm down there. But that's Farm Credit East. This little notch is Yankee Farm Credit, which is Vermont and some of its neighbors. You can see we have almost 15,000 customers and our 20 different branch offices. This is kind of the breakdown of where our money is lent. You can see 23% of our portfolio is dairy. If this was New Jersey only, that sliver would be tiny. But the state of New York is one of the top 5 dairy counties in the country, I believe, still. So that's a good chunk of our portfolio. But you can see we're fairly diversified between your livestock, catch field crops, quite a bit in the timber industry, thanks to Maine and some of New York. But you can see there's a little bit of everything in there, even 4% in aquatic. Ugh, that didn't work out. I just noticed that slide didn't show up right. And even farm services. We have some equipment dealers and some other folks like that. The good advantage of being, if you're part of Farm Credit, you're part of a cooperative. That means we pay you back. You get a dividend from us called patronage. And how our patronage works, it's based on the interest that you pay in every year. You get a percentage of that back. So when you look at the rates that we might have, a certain percentage of that is issued back to you in the form of a check, usually in like February of the following year. And this year, we were actually able to issue a special patronage mid-year thanks to some unique events that occurred on some long-term financing that allowed some money to come back into the association. We have 16 board members. two outside members, and the rest are customers, guys and women who operate farm and agricultural businesses. Our New Jersey representative is Michael Brooks. He's with Dusty Lane Farm down in Pittsgrove Township, New Jersey, down Elmer, Woodstown area. They are a field crop operation, vegetables and grains. And I believe the youngest member of our board, he's in his 30s, just had a baby, in fact. And this is just a bar chart saying the patronage has gone over the years. So, our Young and Beginning Farmer program, that's something that some of you may be interested in. And veteran program, if we have any veterans in the room. We do have some special incentives for folks that meet young, beginning, small, and veteran. Small is sort of an arbitrary thing, but young, under age 35, less than 10 years of experience gets you the first two. If you're a veteran, you don't have to meet those first two criteria. And basically what it is, we can help with some closing costs. We can help with some of our financial services. We can give you discounts on tax prep for the first year or two. I can offer some pretty good discounts on a consulting engagement, et cetera, loan fees, and even in some cases interest rate assistance. So if you fit that criteria, we may be able to offer some of that to you. On request, I have this Harvesting a Profit guide. It's sort of a detailed version of what we did. Yeah. Sorry about that.
So can you write off your lease payments and taxes?
Yes.
So that's
Lease is a deductible expense.
so that,
Yeah, rent is a deductible expense. Principal payments are not. All right. So that's the first big shock that people have when they go from leasing to owning, is all of a sudden, and quite honestly, I mean, that's a good point. When you pay on if you got a big mortgage, you can get a big, we have I have had several examples of customers that end up the end of the year showing a nice tidy profit, but no cash in the bank because of that big principal payment. They make the big principal payment, and insult to injury, they owe income taxes the next year because it was a taxable profit, because principal payments are not deductible, whereas if they were renting the farm, it was. So, that is that's a good question. Our Generation Next seminars, we did these last year. I do these every couple of years. Just a farm, it's some of the type of stuff we've done in this class, again, over a 3-week period. We also contribute a lot to scholarships, etc. Farm Star, some of you may be interested in this, certainly. This is it's a subsidiary that we wholly own that is specifically earmarked to provide seed capital for new businesses. Up to $75,000 investments. It's not enough to go out and buy a big, major farm, but maybe to get you started on a leased operation. We specially set up to where within that program, you develop a business plan, you kind of work hand in hand with a loan officer who is your advisor, and they kind of guide you through some of the financial parts of that. As of 2018, we're actually up to 260 investments now, I think. No, we just went over 250. That's right. That just happened. And then we've invested over 10 million since beginning. So, and we currently have 3.5 million out there. So that's a program. There's a brochure on that program up here. And you just call your local branch to ask about that. And this is everything we do. The middle section there is me. I do the business consulting, estate planning, and farm transfer. I meant to mention this during the business planning section, but this reminds me of it. Your business plan should have this addressed. What happens when I'm not here? What happens if I've got kids that I'm trying to think about? How are we going to do that? If we don't have kids, how are we not going to do that? So very critical part of that business plan. And then financial benchmarking. These are the areas I work in. See, we can do your payroll for you. We can do your tax planning and prep. We can keep your farm records for you, help you get set up. We do have a grant writer that works out of one of our New York branches that can help you, mostly with some of the USDA type grants. New Jersey doesn't have very many grants. New York has a ton of them. And then we do appraisals and crop insurance. That's in addition to financing. Yeah. So I guess this is what you're doing next time. That's what the slide had on it. So that's me. I'm done. Any questions?